Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel the darkest stories of betrayal and tragedy. In today's chilling case, a man wakes from a coma to uncover a devastating secret that will change everything. Anthony and Monique Jefferson had a life many envied. Anthony, a hard-working mechanic, was known for his reliability and warm personality, while Monique, a talented baker, had a smile that could light up any room. Their marriage was built on love, trust, and shared dreams. They lived in a modest yet cozy home in a suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other. The couple often spent their evenings talking about their future, imagining the day they would have children running around the house. Anthony's routine revolved around his garage, where he fixed cars and shared stories with his loyal customers. Monique, on the other hand, spent her days perfecting recipes, selling her baked goods at local markets, and making plans to open her own bakery one day. They weren't wealthy, but they were content, finding joy in the simple moments they shared. One stormy evening, Anthony left work late. Rain poured heavily as he drove his truck home, eager to escape the weather and enjoy Monique's homemade dinner. The wet roads were slick and visibility was poor. As Anthony rounded a bend, an oncoming truck swerved into his lane. In the split second it took for Anthony to react, the collision was unavoidable. The sound of metal crunching against metal echoed in the night. Emergency responders arrived to find Anthony unconscious, trapped in the mangled wreckage of his truck. Monique received the call no spouse ever wants to get. Rushing to the hospital, her heart pounded with fear and disbelief. When she saw Anthony lying motionless in a hospital bed, connected to machines that kept him alive, her world shattered. The doctors explained the severity of his injuries and the uncertainty of his recovery. Anthony had slipped into a coma, and they couldn't predict if or when he would wake up. In the weeks that followed, Monique devoted herself to Anthony's care. She visited him daily, holding his hand, speaking softly to him, and hoping he could hear her. Friends and neighbors offered support, but as the months dragged on, their visits grew less frequent. Monique found herself alone, overwhelmed by the weight of her new reality. The vibrant, loving woman she once was began to fade. Grief consumed her, and the life she had shared with Anthony started to feel like a distant memory. She still loved him, but the long days of waiting and the absence of his presence left a void she couldn't fill. Her trips to the hospital became less frequent, and her connection to Anthony, though strong in her heart, began to feel like a chain holding her back. It was during this period of vulnerability that Monique met Darnell. He was charming, attentive, and seemed to understand her pain in a way no one else could. Their conversations began innocently, but as the weeks turned into months, their relationship deepened. Monique told herself she deserved happiness, even if it was fleeting. Her justifications grew louder as her guilt grew heavier. While Monique carried on with her secret, the man who had once been her everything lay in a hospital bed, unaware of how drastically his world was changing. After 2 long years, the unthinkable happened. Anthony woke up. It was a moment no one expected, not even the doctors who had carefully monitored his condition. Monique received the call in the early morning, and though she rushed to the hospital with a mix of disbelief and relief, there was a trace of fear hidden beneath her joy. She had spent so long convincing herself that Anthony would never recover, that his sudden awakening felt surreal, almost like a dream she wasn't ready to face. Anthony's eyes fluttered open, and the sterile white ceiling of the hospital room came into view. He was weak and disoriented, unable to process how much time had passed or why he was even there. His body felt foreign to him, muscles atrophied and movements restricted. Monique greeted him with tears streaming down her face, her voice trembling as she tried to convey how much she had missed him. Yet, behind her emotional reunion, there was a tension she couldn't fully hide. The days that followed were a whirlwind of medical evaluations and therapy sessions. Anthony struggled to regain his strength, his body refusing to cooperate in ways that left him frustrated. Monique stayed by his side, assisting him as he navigated his recovery. She helped him eat, spoke encouraging words, and made sure he had everything he needed. On the surface, she appeared to be the devoted wife, but internally, a storm brewed. Anthony began to notice subtle changes in Monique's behavior. Her smiles seemed forced, her eyes distant. She would often leave the hospital for long periods, claiming she needed to handle errands or step away to clear her head. At first, Anthony didn't question it. He assumed she was overwhelmed by the stress of caring for him and managing her own life. As the weeks went by, Anthony began piecing together bits of information about the time he had lost. Friends who visited would share updates about the world, and he would ask questions about how Monique had managed during his absence. The answers were always vague, filled with awkward pauses and quick changes of subject. Anthony sensed something wasn't right, but he chose not to press too hard. His focus was on getting better and returning to the life he had left behind. Monique, however, was unraveling under the weight of her secret. The relationship with Darnell had continued, though she tried to keep it at arm's length once Anthony woke up. She deleted messages, avoided phone calls when Anthony was around, and crafted stories to cover her tracks. But the guilt gnawed at her, growing stronger each time she looked into Anthony's eyes. One evening, as Monique stepped out to run errands, Anthony found himself alone in their hospital room. His recovery had progressed to the point where he could move around unassisted, though slowly. Bored and curious, he reached for her phone, which she had accidentally left behind. What he found shattered the fragile peace he had been clinging to. Messages and photos between Monique and Darnell painted a vivid picture of betrayal. While Anthony's heart raced as he stared at the screen, the woman he had loved and trusted had been living a double life while he lay helpless in a coma. A wave of anger surged through him, but he stayed silent. He returned the phone to its original place before Monique came back, determined not to let her see the storm raging inside him. For now, he would wait, watching and planning his next move. Anthony's discovery of Monique's betrayal marked the beginning of a transformation within him. He no longer saw her as the devoted wife who had stood by his side through his darkest days. Instead, she became a stranger, someone who had violated the sacred trust they had once shared. Though his heart was heavy with anger and hurt, he remained outwardly calm, unwilling to confront her just yet. He began observing her more closely, paying attention to the details he had once overlooked. Her frequent absences, her hurried explanations, and the subtle tension in her demeanor all pointed to the truth he had uncovered. Anthony's mind raced as he pieced together her movements and habits. He noticed that she often left the house in the evenings, sometimes for hours at a time, always returning with flimsy excuses about errands or meeting a friend. Anthony started planning. He kept his emotions carefully hidden, ensuring Monique saw nothing but the mask of a recovering husband focused on regaining his strength. He attended his therapy sessions, worked on rebuilding his mobility, and even showed appreciation for her efforts to care for him. But beneath the surface, a storm of resentment was brewing, and his thoughts grew darker with each passing day. When Monique wasn't around, Anthony began exploring ways to confirm his suspicions. He secretly accessed her phone on multiple occasions, gathering more evidence of her affair with Darnell. The messages were frequent and intimate, filled with details that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Each new discovery deepened Anthony's sense of betrayal, but he kept his emotions in check. To ensure he wasn't being paranoid, Anthony started tracking Monique's movements. He would feign exhaustion in the evenings, encouraging her to leave without suspecting his intentions. Once she was gone, he would follow her at a safe distance, careful not to be seen. On several occasions, he watched as she met Darnell in secluded places, their interactions confirming everything he had already uncovered. Anthony's internal struggle grew more intense. Part of him wanted to confront Monique immediately, to demand answers and force her to face the consequences of her actions. But another part of him, one fueled by pain and anger, sought something far more permanent. Forgiveness felt impossible, and the idea of simply walking away seemed unthinkable. He began to see himself as a man with nothing left to lose, consumed by thoughts of retribution. Despite the emotional turmoil, Anthony remained calculated in his actions. He continued to play the role of a loving husband, never allowing Monique to see the depths of his anguish. He started preparing for what he believed was the only way to restore his dignity and make her understand the magnitude of her betrayal. His thoughts turned to revenge, and he began to plan every detail carefully, ensuring nothing was left to chance. The nights grew longer as Anthony's resolve hardened. He knew he couldn't let Monique's actions go unanswered, and the idea of confronting her with words felt inadequate. He wanted her to feel the pain she had inflicted on him, to understand the depth of the destruction her choices had caused. As his plan took shape, Anthony felt a sense of clarity, even as he stood on the edge of a decision that would change both their lives forever. Anthony's suspicions had been confirmed long ago, but now he was determined to witness the betrayal in its rawest form. One fateful night, Monique claimed she needed to meet a friend for dinner, offering her usual vague explanation. Anthony feigned understanding, even encouraging her to go while he stayed home, pretending to be tired from his therapy sessions. Once Monique left, Anthony quickly grabbed his coat and followed her, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. His heart pounded with a mix of rage and anticipation as he tailed her car through the quiet streets. The trail ended at a small, secluded motel on the outskirts of town, its dimly lit parking lot a stark contrast to the storm raging in Anthony's mind. He parked his car at a distance, watching as Monique stepped out of hers and walked confidently toward one of the rooms. Moments later, Darnell appeared, greeting her with an embrace that shattered any lingering doubts Anthony might have had. The sight was devastating, but it solidified his resolve. He stayed hidden, observing their interaction until they disappeared inside the room. Anthony sat in his car for hours, his thoughts spiraling. The betrayal was undeniable, but it was the ease with which Monique carried out her deceit that stung the most. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a mistake. It was a calculated choice repeated again and again. As the hours dragged on, Anthony replayed the scene in his mind, each repetition fueling the dark thoughts that had taken root within him. When Monique returned home later that night, Anthony was waiting for her. He sat in the living room, the faint glow of the television casting shadows across his face. Monique greeted him with a forced smile, her tone light as she casually recounted her fabricated evening. Anthony nodded along, masking his true emotions with a calm exterior. He allowed her to believe her secret was safe, that she had once again gotten away with her lies. As Monique went to bed, Anthony remained seated, his mind racing. He felt as though he were standing at the edge of a precipice, the weight of her betrayal pushing him closer to a decision he could never undo. He thought about the life they had built together, the dreams they once shared, and the love he had poured into their relationship. All of it felt meaningless now, overshadowed by the pain and humiliation she had caused. That night, Anthony barely slept. He stayed awake, staring at the ceiling as the events of the past few months replayed in his mind. The betrayal, the lies, and the facade Monique maintained all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. She had chosen to destroy their marriage. And now, Anthony was choosing how he would respond. The next morning, the house was quiet, but an ominous tension hung in the air. Monique went about her routine, unaware of the storm brewing within her husband. Anthony watched her closely, his expression unreadable. He had reached his breaking point, and as Monique carried on with her day, she had no idea that her world was about to come crashing down. The day began like any other, a routine Monique had grown accustomed to in the wake of Anthony's recovery. She moved through the house, preparing breakfast, offering the same forced smiles and pleasantries she had for weeks. Anthony, as always, played his part convincingly, nodding in agreement, responding with measured calm, and hiding the storm that brewed within. Every detail of this morning felt like a final act. Anthony had made his decision. The rage he had harbored since discovering her betrayal had simmered into a cold, calculated resolve. For weeks, he had replayed every moment of deceit, every lie Monique had told, and every fleeting glance she gave him while her heart belonged to someone else. He could no longer bear the weight of his anger. Today, the facade would crumble, and the truth would finally have consequences. As Monique prepared to leave the house under the pretense of running errands, Anthony calmly offered to help her carry some items to the car. She seemed slightly taken aback by the gesture, but she didn't question it. Anthony's demeanor remained steady, betraying none of the turmoil that churned beneath the surface. As she walked to the vehicle, he followed close behind, his steps measured and deliberate. Once they reached the driveway, Monique turned to unlock the car, oblivious to the danger that loomed behind her. In an instant, Anthony struck, his actions swift and fueled by months of pent-up fury. The world seemed to stand still as Monique crumpled to the ground, her shocked expression frozen in time. Anthony stood over her, his chest heaving, his mind racing. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, but Anthony felt no relief. Instead, he was overwhelmed by an eerie sense of detachment, as though he were watching himself from a distance. The woman he had once loved, who had been his partner and confidant, now lay lifeless before him, a casualty of her own betrayal. Anthony returned to the house, his movements mechanical and void of emotion. He cleaned himself up, disposing of the evidence with meticulous precision. Every action was deliberate, driven by the need to maintain control over a situation that had spiraled so far out of it. As the hours passed, Anthony began crafting his version of events. When neighbors noticed Monique's absence, he feigned concern, telling them she had gone out earlier and hadn't returned. He even called the police, filing a missing persons report with an air of genuine worry. His performance was convincing, a stark contrast to the grim reality that he alone knew. Days turned into weeks, and the search for Monique yielded no results. Anthony continued to play the grieving husband, attending community gatherings and offering heartfelt thanks to those who supported him during his loss. In the eyes of the world, he was a man devastated by the unexplained disappearance of his wife. But deep down, Anthony knew the truth could not remain buried forever. The weight of his actions pressed heavily upon him, even as he tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy. His life, once filled with love and promise, had been reduced to a hollow shell, haunted by the choices he had made and the betrayal that had driven him to this point.